Finance Director, Trina Larson. Trina.
Good evening. This evening is our evening that we take to go over our capital improvement program, the financing mechanisms of which, how we fund that program, and then we like to look at our GeoDebt in general and where our goals are at and do we need to potentially update those goals. So I'll step right into our PowerPoint presentation for the Common Council and the Mayor and the public. One last note, this presentation will be available tomorrow under Hot Topics of the City. So if you would like to view it or see the handouts, you can access that on the City of Oshkosh website. So as some of you are familiar with, the CIP is broke out into several categories. The goal of these categories is really to just separate each type of infrastructure or equipment improvement that we're making. Some of them are comprehensive street utility improvements, major equipment, stormwater. This categorization allows us to also then appropriately align the funding sources. So there are many ways of which you can fund the CIP, and on this PowerPoint I have listed some of the sources that we do use. The CIP is heavily funded with debt, and that is a combination of GeoDebt and revenue debt, but there are many donations, there are trust transfers, there's TIF donations, and so there's multiple ways of funding this plan in its entirety, but it is heavily funded with debt. The one thing that we have really improved over on the last few years is truly analyzing our purchases and looking at should we be utilizing cash or debt to fund some of our expenditures that are within our CIP program. We have also looked at the introduction of financing special assessments and pursuing additional grants, and then applying some of that tax incremental financing to pursue further economic development within the city. For these reasons, these are being currently usually funded with debt. However, we do pursue cash when possible. TIF 7 would be a great example. That is a TIF district that applied several million into our capital improvement plan and injected direct cash with no debt being issued. There were many districts that benefited from that TIF 21, TIF 23, and is a large part of the further economic development that was continued off of that TIF district donation. So we have four forms of debt. The four forms of debt are general obligation debt. General obligation debt breaks into 10 and 20 years. The most important part or component of general obligation debt is truly aligning the life cycle of your assets with the term of your bonds or your notes. This has been of particular emphasis for the city the last 5 years, and something that we're now seeing. It is impacting our overall debt service payments, but the alignment of truly paying for an asset with its life cycle will benefit the city in the long term. We've also utilized state trust fund loans. Some good examples of the state trust fund loans is the transition or the transaction of which we funded the unfunded pension liability with that state trust fund loan that leveraged and saved the city several millions of dollars. We also issue revenue bonds, and we do issue revenue bonds for all three utilities: the water utility, the sanitary sewer utility, and the stormwater utility.
The notes, and we've talked about this before, but we've been making increasing usage of notes versus the bonds because of, as Trina mentioned, some of those items, the life wasn't exactly 20 years, and so we wanted to make sure that we were borrowing it for the right term. And that's really the best analogy that we can use is if you're doing a 30-year mortgage versus a 15-year mortgage, you can pay it off quicker using the 15-year mortgage, but you pay a greater payment. And that's what we've seen. Some of our increases in debt service have been a result of us borrowing for a shorter term. From a Moody's standpoint, that's very good. If we're going to borrow, the shorter the term we borrow for, generally the better it's looked at. And they do take a look at one of their factors. It's not the biggest one, but one of the things they take a look at is what percent of your debt is 10 years or less. So that's something that we become aware of and we've been doing more of, but it's really a matter more of necessity than it has been necessarily because Moody's will like it. Moody's does like it, but we know that it's more appropriate for us to do the 10-year borrowing. And in even some cases, Trina's taken a look at something and said, even though it may be appropriate for 10 years, if we can package the financing to maybe front load it a little more, then maybe it's only 7 years or something like that. And we've taken a look at that and considered it like with garbage trucks. Garbage trucks, they take a pretty good beating, but so they don't last necessarily even 10 years. We are putting a 10-year life on those things. They're really not making it 10 years. It's just the nature of the beast. I mean, you're loading, glass and heavy paper, and so you've got the amount of
It technically self-destruct.
yeah, and that's the nature of its work.
You're talking about the automated, right?
Yeah, but even before that with the non-automated, at least we're saving people's backs now.
I was just gonna say, the trucks can't be taking any worse a beating than the humans.
Oh,
do.
our workers' comp costs
That's
have
way down, way
plummeted
down.
because essentially now, instead of somebody getting out of their truck or jumping off the back of the truck, no problem with that. You think about it now, the nostalgia of somebody jumping off the garbage truck and grabbing a garbage can, and each one weighs a little different. The workers' comp cost plummeted because instead of having two people, one of whom was wrenching their back at every move, you have one person who drives up and operates a joystick and just, their finesse is phenomenal. To watch those people do their work is amazing because they become very good at it. But it's not the same back-breaking work that it was, so we're saving a lot on workers' comp, which we're very pleased about. But those trucks still take a beating. So, and that's just one example. But I think that 10 and 20 years, as our costs have gone up on the debt service side, it's not just because we're borrowing more, we're borrowing for shorter periods. And until we adjust, we talked about it plateauing in a few years or something like that. But we still have a few years before we plateau that, and maybe it starts to even out on the cost. But anyway, I just wanted to get that in there because that's part of what we do when we look at the borrowings. Sorry, Trina.
No, perfect, thank you. So, we like to talk about general obligation, but what is general obligation debt? So, general obligation debt is something that is backed by full pledge of our tax levy. It is the most inexpensive way to finance debt. When you're using your revenue debt, you're pledging your direct revenue from your utilities, and so you are incurring debt at a higher interest rate. Many years ago, the city was primarily only in general obligation, but as our capital plan expanded and grew in dollars, and we started to look at our general obligation capacity, we had the need to start the utilization of revenue debt for those utilities, and that's a very good use because it's giving that direct correlation and pledging those utility revenues against the debt. But it does come at a somewhat of a larger cost. General obligation is the most reliable debt. It's widely recognized and available. It's one of the most marketable debt obligations. Generally, when we do have issues, we will get more bids on our general obligation debt versus our revenue debt. And the lowest interest rate of them all, we kind of talked about. It's also tax exempt. And so what that means is you are receiving that at a tax exempt rate. There are some strings that come along with that tax exemption, which is anything that is financed with general obligation debt must have public use and public access. And so you couldn't finance a improvement that would just benefit one person. You need to have that public benefit to be applying general obligation debt. So some samples of our GeoDebt that we have used. Recently, in 2017 was our first year of which we applied special assessment and we started to borrow for those versus waiting for those payments to come in. That was a cash and a fund balance situation, as the cash payments were not coming in more than what we were expending. And so to front load those with debt, and then now the payments will repaying the debt that was issued. We've used it for some TIF projects and also as an alternative revenue debt if there is available capacity. The capital outlay items, to be in the capital improvement program, it must have a life of more than 10 years. And that's, for example, Mark spoke about the garbage trucks. You'll see those garbage trucks in our operations budgets because they do not meet that 10-year life threshold.
The recycling trucks are in the operations budget.
Okay, thank you, the recycling trucks. So one of the challenges that you have is with the capacity limits, things do compete, and that is one of the items that as we grew our public infrastructure and the investment in that, we're starting to see more competition between street projects, public building projects, equipment needs, and how do we truly fund all of these items under the umbrella of GeoDebt. And so we'll go into that in further detail in future slides. So how has the city really applied general obligation debt? We kind of talked about this previously, but on this page lists some really good examples of applications that we've used. Some of the ones for the TIF or economic development is we did use some GeoDebt for the Best Western. For the development that occurred in the Aviation Business Park. That's one of our business parks that we're looking to expand and grow new business development into. And we use it a limited amount for the Oshkosh Corporation Global Headquarters. That project is funded with many other funding sources, but a portion of it was GEO. One important use of the general obligation debt is the Riverwalk. Many of the citizens are utilizing that, and I don't think they realize that that general obligation debt that we're taking for the Riverwalk is generally always matched with funds from the DNR. There's not many Riverwalk projects in the city of Oshkosh that have been financed only with GeoDebt. There's been a combination of a DNR grant along the side with that general obligation debt, which has allowed us to expand and get that Riverwalk into more areas of the city.
And we wouldn't get those grants without those matching funds.
The 10-year notes, so those are primarily used when we're financing vehicles and equipment and some other limited purposes. So this brings me to the model which some of you are familiar with. Where are we at with our GeoDebt capacity, and have we reached the target that the Common Council established for us back in about 2014? What the goal was that we would be under a 70% debt capacity by 2020. In working with the Common Council and establishing a model truly with the principle of limiting the amount of GeoDebt issued, I'm happy to report we have reached that benchmark, and as you can see in the highlighted area, we're down to the 64.47%, coming off that 78.55%. That is something that took a lot of commitment and a lot of strategy in our equipment and in our infrastructure and truly prioritization of the projects. But I think it's something that is always discussed in our annual Moody's rating call, and something that we really need to be proud of as a city, that we were able to reach that target, and we reached it even earlier than we had initially targeted in. The item that I will call your attention to is then if you now go down to 2027, what would be the impact of this current philosophy if we continued it? You'll see we'll hit that 50.62% of debt capacity. What really is important about that? 50% seems to be about the sweet spot where Moody's is going to start to entertain an upgrade in our rating. And the better the rating we can receive, the more discounted we can issue debt. But they really don't even want to engage a upgrade conversation until we can target in on that 50%.
Yeah, we've looked at other communities that have that rating currently, and generally their debt capacity is 50% or below it. So we know that's our talking point that we need to keep working. And so the other thing I guess we would point out is we've made an assumption that there'd be no change in equalized value. So that's a pretty conservative assumption. But the other one that we've also made is that we would not do any additional borrowing beyond the 11.4 million. And we've had some discussions recently about that. So just to give you an idea, those are the assumptions going in, because we've just kind of frozen that. But we're already below 65%, so we're 5% lower 2 years earlier than we anticipated. And Mayor, I know that was a big issue that the council put in the strategic plan back in 14. And so, we're excited that we've been able to do it. You can see that it's amazing what can happen when we get equalized value bump. That made the difference. We were making good progress when we were limiting ourselves, but the real progress came when we said, no, we gotta, if we can get some equalized value bump, then it'll help us.
Well, as you recall too, that was a very aggressive number back in 2014. And I think even Moody's thought we were being very aggressive back then, and we've exceeded our target ahead of time, so that's.
And we hit that target, and the council approved the WRS buyout after they set the goal. So the first thing the council did was put us in a hole deeper, and that was the right thing to do. I don't want to make that, it didn't come out as well as I wanted it to, but we said, but that's the right thing to do, even though it's going to take us a step back. But we looked at it, and we are
Didn't
going
hurt
to
us
be,
at all.
No, and we are going to be extremely thankful in later years, because we are saving a lot on interest as a result of that decision.
We talk about getting down to that 50%, that sweet spot for a better Moody's rating. I think I've asked this once before, but what's the actual benefit that Moody's is going to give us? Obviously, a better rating is helpful, but what's the extra discount? What's the extra, where's the interest savings? What are we actually going to see by getting to that goal? What's the real savings that we're going to have?
This is a very broad statement, but I think generally you're probably looking at 1/4 to 0.5%. They'll talk basis points, but.
Of course.
Yeah, but I think you're really talking about 1/4 to 0.5%. Over the life of something, that's gonna be very good. When you take a look at some of our metrics, the Wisconsin Policy Forum that we forwarded you in last week's newsletter showed our debt. Compared to our peer communities, we're higher. We can't hide behind, we can't make excuses, that's just where we are. So I think we need to improve, not just because we'll get a better rate, although we will. And even 1/4 or 0.5% over the life of a bond, that can mean several $100,000. So think about every bond issue we do, several $100,000 every year with every issue. So that's that can mean quite a bit of savings over the life. I mean, when you're comparing a mortgage and look at the interest payments you pay in a 30 versus 15, that's probably the best analogy we can come up with. We've got a few more of these same charts, so we want to kind of walk through this to give you an idea of where we're leaning towards recommending for the council.
So on the next slide is just a graphic presentation of what you saw on the previous slide, but you'll see the impact of the model and the success that we've seen. And really what this is showing is the growth in that debt capacity from where we started in 2014 to where we are projecting to be in 2027. So what you have on this next slide is what does our 2019 GEO borrowing look like? And what we've done is we've broke this out by each major category. You'll see that we do have proposed GEO projects of the 14,423,400. However, of that 2,023,400 of that will be TID contribution. That would be those TIF 7 contributions that I was speaking about previously. So what we are bringing forward to the Common Council is, and we plan on proposing, is a $12,400,000 GEO borrowing. And so what does that mean for the city? So like I just spoke about, we had traditionally had that $11,400,000 cap in this year, and in the 2020 year, we are proposing to go up $1 million. That proposal will keep us below our target goal, which we have already reached. And monies that are levied cash are also being only applied to maintenance and reoccurring. So it's making sure that $1 million investment that you're seeing in that operation budget every year, we try to levy $1 million for items that have a shorter life cycle, or it just makes better financial planning and strategy to pay cash up front. Ideally, as we continue to and we start to come down and equalize our debt service payments, we would increase this amount that we're cash funding our capital improvement program in lieu of debt. That's a few years down the road, but something we really want to be cognitive of in every operations budget, that we're at least pledging that $1 million because that helps us in our long-term financial planning. The side note is, we know that one of our very long-term goals is an equipment replacement fund. And so rather than using borrowing or cash, we actually have a revolving fund that gives us the ability to fund equipment without looking at debt or levy. So that is a long-term goal that we're looking towards. So like I spoke about, our 2-year projection is at the $12,400,000. What we have done, and we have spoken about this previously, but just want to bring everybody back onto the same page. We had done about $3.5 to $3.8 million in streets. The one thing that we are truly seeing with the improvement in the economy and the improvement on the private sector side, the cost to construct roads and infrastructures are going up a lot. A lot of that's related to the economy. We're seeing also an impact on the steel tariff. And the steel that's used in our road construction, those are starting to drive our costs. And so what we are wanting to do is to put that additional $1 million into these street road construction projects for 2019 and 2020. The years for 2021 to 2023 are what we call in a fluid state. we do not balance those to a set general obligation amount, but the projects, in particular the road projects, are fairly set and have had a long 10-year approach and analysis to what would be included into the capital improvement program. So as we talk about the CIP, I always like to reflect back to and look at where we came from and how did we start to meet this $11,400,000, and how has our capital improvement program evolved? And I just love the terminology personally. So when we started looking at needing to tighten our spending and prioritize project, we established the system of priority. And the first category was gotta do. And gotta do is as simple as the car doesn't start and it's not gonna go down the road and you've gotta replace it. Those critical projects here in the city that had contractual obligations, we had established long-term commitments, we needed to maintain equipment replacement schedules. One really important item that we had a lesson on at the city are police cars, and we had chose to delay the purchase of some police cars, and that impact of not purchasing those police cars was impacted the next several years of the police operations budget because maintenance grew at an astronomical level, and so we were putting good money at bad. And so trying to keep equipment replacement cycles are something we are very conservative, and we provide a lot of analysis in detail to make sure that the money that we are putting into maintenance is extending the life of the asset and that we are getting a return on that maintenance that we're investing. Other items, public and employee health, safety, and security. When you're serving the citizens of the Oshkosh, this is always an important criteria and part of the prioritization and the gotta do. And finally, ensuring long-term infrastructure needs are met. And then we have the next category, step down, need to do. Items nearing the end of useful life with increasing non-value added maintenance. Adherence to replacement schedules in order to avoid log jams, and proactive projects to afford gotta do status.
To avoid. You said afford.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, to avoid. And these two categories is where, if I really be honest and I think about how we fund the CIP program, is truly where we're funding right now. We are able to hit the gotta do, and we flow down in the need to do, but we don't even necessarily hit things that would all classify under the need to do.
I think if you take a look at a lot of our, James is here so he can kind of vouch for this. Our snowplow trucks, for example, you know, we hang on to them 15, 20 years in some cases. They don't all make it that long. And so what we do is we prioritize. It's almost like a little bit of a casualty type of trauma, ER type of prioritization.
Yeah, the mechanics manager takes a look at how much they're spending every year on maintenance of all the vehicles, and you know, if we see one vehicle is really starting to rise whereas some of the other ones aren't, well, you know, that's going to be the one that is being looked at for replacement. You know, we do a pretty in-depth look at all of those before we recommend which vehicle is going to get replaced.
And every once in a while you get, you know, for lack of a better term, you get a lemon year, and the truck just is not as good. And we see that, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is heading for the graveyard a lot quicker. And rather than just say, well, it's not as old as these ones, we know we got to replace that eventually. And so those are that whole issue of the log jam, because I think we found that with our buses recently. It's not that they weren't necessarily performing, but the logjam of having to replace 10 vehicles in a 3-year period was just insurmountable. So we stretched it out over 5-6 years maybe, but when it's all said and done, it'll probably be over 5 or 6 years. We need to stretch that out to make it a little more affordable over the long term.
And Trina, when you first came here, I talked to you about leasing versus purchasing of vehicles and equipment. We still prefer to purchase rather than lease.
Yeah, one department where we did get into leasing would be our golf. In our enterprise fund, due to lack of available cash, a leasing program did work well, and so we did purchase 3 pieces of equipment. But we are continually looking at that as a possible savings and a manner for the city to finance capital. With the accounting and GASB changes, they're starting to change how you look at a lease and how you book, and it's becoming very similar to it's treating it as if it is a debt obligation. But we do continue to look at that as an option for the city.
I'm trying to think of it. We've done it in some other cases. I just can't think of them off the top of my head.
The one we did look at, which we didn't proceed with, was a quint. When we had the 2 quints back to back, we did look at the option of entertaining a lease for one of them. It was not economically feasible, or there weren't any advantages in pursuing that. But it is something we do continue to look at.
More likely, and the reason we did it with golf was because those enterprise funds, because they do act more like a private business, that there is value to doing those. So that was one case. But frankly, I think part of it is we hang on to these vehicles until there's, the last thread of life is left in them. And when you hang on to it that long, it generally makes sense to own it rather than lease it. But I know we've taken a look. We may have a couple of those examples, and
The golf carts were
I know that,
a
but-
very strong lease program, which were very beneficial to
Yeah.
participate in.
Well, at one time when Leach was still in business, they had a very active and aggressive lease program for communities.
I think we've looked at it on some of the more specialized streets division equipment as well. And I do know with our last grader purchase, we actually planned on, buying a used unit that had come off of, a 3 to 5 year lease somewhere else. And we got a really good deal going that route. So those are some of the things that we've looked at as well. Instead of buying a brand new vehicle, buying one that's just come off of, a 3 to 5 year lease that's still got 20 years of life left in it, and getting it at a much reduced price.
There's a lot of pretty good maintenance programs too, and that's part of the leasing that you've got to do, just like a
Right.
car.
Right.
And there was one piece of equipment we looked at this year, which
The
Public Works had sought
the recycling grinder is something
Yeah, the grinder.
is something we're evaluating how to proceed with, whether it's buying a new piece of equipment, leasing a piece of equipment, or going to a contractual service. So we're looking at a lot of different options with that as well. That's the brush grinder that's used at the yard waste collection site.
But the impact of that, because you move it from operational to debt service, that has an impact too. Because you're just saying, if you've got certain ones under lease where GASB considers it operational, it's not necessarily a debt service, it's an operational cost, correct?
correct.
So you've got to worry about actual accounting functions as well, not just pure dollars and cents, but
Yep.
actually moving them from one budget to another.
And you remind,
And funding sources.
and with your statement, you click something else in my mind, expenditure restraint. Once it becomes an operational cost, becomes an expenditure restraint cost. Unfortunately, that's the reality we have to deal with. Technically, we shouldn't. We should look at it as a pure financial
What makes
deal.
sense-
And
what makes the best sense?
what makes the best sense. Golf, it made sense because it didn't show up on our expenditure restraint books. So that made sense. The grinder is another one that we're taking a hard look at because it's funded primarily with state grants and our recycling fee. So there may be some value to taking a look at it. So we continue to say, oh, is this one worth taking a look at? And we evaluate those options.
So the last category was the should do. And it's just like it sounds. Continued investment in culture, recreation, and education facilities, neighborhood development, avoidance of increased maintenance costs, adherence to recommended replacement schedules, and meeting other goals of the city's strategic plan, and proactive projects to avoid future gotta-do status. So this is where we started in 2015. After 2015, we were charged with by the Common Council of getting a more enhanced prioritization system and looking at the possibility of a formal CIP policy. And so in 2015, the Long Range Finance did do a policy, and it was adopted by the Common Council. And that new policy was implemented in the 2016 and 2020 CIP process. This policy implemented a new scoring system that assisted in the prioritization of the capital improvement projects. Well, how I like to look at it is it really just assigned a metric into gotta do, need to do, and should do. I feel it's been an effective tool, and as we reflect back and we look at this annually on the scoring, there's about 10 items that are graded or assigned a numeric value by both the departments and the city manager. And then the scoring is usually relatively very similar, and the need of replacement is generally derived in the final outcome and aggregate score of all the projects. So that was a much enhanced capital improvement program, but it really just emphasized what we were already doing. So we have talked about, we've met our benchmark or our target for that 70% benchmark. And we've also talked about how the cost of capital has started to increase. And so what we wanted to bring forward in these next slides are we ready to look at our model in a potential philosophical change in our debt? And so what this first slide is doing is it's taking our traditional model and it's assigning on a 0.441 growth trend in equalized value. Whereas in the previous model, we always analyze that at a constant. The one exception to that is 2019. You'll see that that is higher than the 0.41 growth factor, and that's for the closure of TIF 7. That equalized value will be coming on, and so we know that there will be much more gain in equalized value.
But the reason 0.41 wasn't just pulled out of the sky, 0.41 is our growth rate, our average growth rate for the last 10 years. So we felt that was a number that we could look at and say, okay, has some basis in history now. Of course, the old adage that you hear on the investment commercials, past performance is not indicative of future performance, but for purposes of this analysis, that's why we chose 0.41%.
Yes, thank you. So the one thing that I will show you is in that debt principal taken on, what we have modeled through 2027 is the $12,400,000 with that constant 0.41%. And you'll see in 2027, we would not reach our 50% target. This is only 9 years that this is showing, however, but we wouldn't hit it in a 10th year either. And so how does that look for our debt capacity and where we're at? Still very similar to the previous model, and you still see the separation of our available debt capacity with that growth. So the next point was then let's look at a 0.81 growth, and that was looking at a 3-year previous year trend of where it had equalized out at.
But it was also, what would it take for us to get to to get to 50%
To the 50%.
by the end of this analysis. So what would it take? And 0.81 just happened to be the number that came up.
I guess I see it two ways. Either you're looking to, if you want to get to 0.5, you're either paying down more debt or you're increasing your anticipated valuation. And that's how you got there. Because otherwise, we're taking on $9 to $10 more million of debt. And with that $1 million increase proposal, and had we not done that, or if we don't do that, we get to our 0.5.
We're just showing how the
Yep.
variables
Yep.
work. Yeah, and
Yep.
unfortunately, we don't have control over the equalized value, or a little control over it. We can talk about economic development, but we don't have the control. We can control, because all council has to say is, here's the number. And we've been holding that 11.4 pretty solidly since back, and even though that, I think it's been back from the time Trina came on board in 2014. So anyway, you can see,
Yep, so what the outcome of this truly would be if the equalized value projection holds is we would hit that 50% benchmark in 2027 with the expectation or the estimate of the 12,400,000. And so Matt, you draw a good conclusion, because as I looked at this evening, last night, I also was thinking about the current model and these two models that we were bringing forward. And when I thought about it, the equalized value greatly increases the outcome versus the amount of debt, because you're growing in the several millions versus the debt we're taking on. Right now, we're looking at proposing the 1 million. And so, several ways you could look at this, but yeah, when you're analyzing it to look at in comparison to the three models, you'll see that the biggest, for me, the takeaway was the biggest factor influencing this is our equalized value.
and it shows, I mean, you take a look at a fast-growing community, they can grow more because they've got that equalized value just keeps going on an arc up. When you don't have that, and the last decade, our growth has averaged 0.41, and that was with the last couple of years really being the lion's share of our growth. We had actually decreasing equalized values from 2008 through 2015. So it really shows what happens when you have very little growth or negative growth. So a little growth goes a long way. I remember when Ehlers was putting together debt projections years ago, and when I say years ago, probably pre-2008, they would put 2% growth rate in there, and they would call it a very, this is a conservative estimate. So 2% growth, you're going to be able to do this. Well, we haven't been able to plug in a 2% growth rate in the longest time, and we're getting excited over the possibility of 0.81%. So that's less than half of what a conservative number was 12 years ago. So it's really amazing what that does. Can you grow out of debt? The answer is yes, but can you really? Is it going to happen? That's the real trick.
So then we just have the two charts following our model. So what does this mean, and what are we looking at? We tried to find a fancy term, and as much as you want to dress this up and come up with the key phrase, what we're really talking about influencing our debt capacity is really economically controlled. So favorable economic conditions. What we would like the council to consider is looking at the current borrowing limitations. We're not able to fund all of that, the gotta do and need to do or should do buckets. And what happens when we can't finance them, we bump them out in year 3, 4, or 5, or some of the projects just remain unfunded. And as our community has started to grow and we're seeing the economic development, we want a holding place for the projects that if something were to happen, they're on your radar and you know about them. And so how do we address that? And how do we put that into our plan, but also not decrease our gains that we have made in decreasing our debt capacity? So what we're proposing is a new category, and I like to call it the FEC category. And basically what that will do is these projects that would go under this FEC category would be projects that the council would have the purview to add them into the capital improvement program if the correct economic conditions are met or exceeded. And so much of, like, I like to think about the budget, and when we do an a la carte list, could be our CIP a la carte list. And if we have a year of tremendous growth, we look at how that impacts the model and how it impacts the model long term. And do you as a body look at placing them into the active CIP? So what we've done is we've added this new category in the years in this current year CIP, so the 2019 through 2023, and these projects are in 2020 through 2022.
So we make the assumption that that 50% target is something that's worthwhile, which we believe it is. Now that we've hit our initial target, I think what we're asking council is, we want you to consider what you want our new target to be. That was part of the strategic plan way back when. And do we want to reset our sights on a new target and have us start working towards that target?
Can we just go back to page 22 real quickly, under equalized value, which there's an impact from economic development. What gives us the biggest bang for our buck when we look at economic development? Housing, apartments, industrial, commercial. Where should we be focusing our efforts in those of, say, GoEDC, that will give us the greatest return on our investment? We talk about, we have a lot of industrial land sitting there growing grass. Where should we be focusing our efforts to increase that equalized value?
I wish Alan was here to really answer your question, so I'll try to do justice to what Alan has done in the past. He'll tell you quite honestly that the one that you want the least for economic growth is residential and single family, because it's the least dense, it costs a lot to provide services. Now, that has a kind of a ridiculous tone to that answer, because the whole we exist for the people, and to say, well, we don't want people, it just right. Doesn't make sense. The idea behind that is, and right now in this market, we need people to fill jobs. So for us to say, well, we don't want people, just defies logic. But economically, you'll find that retail does a great deal of good square foot value per square foot. So you get the most value per square foot, but sometimes you get the greatest non-residential demand for services comes from those areas. Kind of like what we've been pitching with the dark store.
The big box stores.
Big box stores, because of, for all, whether it's people, theft or robbery or break-ins, things like that. Those put a lot of demands, but per square foot, they deliver some pretty good bang for the buck.
Unless they sue us.
Yeah, unless they sue us. Manufacturing does a very good job because it provides wealth. Make good manufacturing jobs make our public wealthier, and that's a good thing. So it's probably more per square foot is the number, and per square foot, yeah, you can get some pretty good numbers when you have a retail. You get a low density residential, the per square foot of the house is usually pretty good, but it's spread out over such a large area, you just don't get as big a bang for the buck. Again, Alan would do a much more effective job, and I'd encourage you to pull him aside and ask that same question, because that's a question that the economic development folks over the years have been asked. But it's a balancing act. We know that residences
Right.
put a demand in for schools and for parks and for all the things that we enjoy in life, they should be able to enjoy it the same way we enjoy it.
But I think it's a discussion we have to have with Alan and people like OEDC, that here's where you should really be spending your time. I mean, you're right, we gotta look at everything, but where do we really get the most return on our people investment?
Because manufacturing, for an example, if we add manufacturing into the Southwest Industrial Park or the Aviation Industrial Park, it does have a bigger impact than a small or less than commercial enterprise, where the manufacturing side will have a bigger equalized value impact and have many more cascading positive things.
Higher wages as a
That
rule.
discussion needs to happen with GoEDC because of the focus of, or lack of focus on attracting outside entities that come to Oshkosh. They've said it's more about keeping what we have and growing what we have, but at some point, we've got to attract something new to grow it quicker.
Sorry.
That's
No,
okay.
no, that was an excellent comment.
So we're back on page 26, Trina.
Yep. So since we weren't able to coin it, but we got FEC now, what are favorable economic conditions? So we feel this would exist when the city's equalized value increases more than or exceeds the growth rate to hit that target rate of 50%. And any project that we would add in would not jeopardize the target rate of 50%. So if the Common Council is in agreement that that 50% target is where we want to head, we would base these decisions in adding additional projects into the CIP and evaluate that long-term impact on the model.
What it does is, instead of having the basis be the hard 11.4, how are we doing? And we it's not just setting the target at 50%, it's also setting the target at a specific date. Because you can always say, well, then let's just set the target date for 2050. Well, then you're not making the progress. So it's really more, you tell us where you want to move towards, and we'll keep pace with that target. We do better, we can pick up the pace. If we do poorer,
But to slow down.
we gotta slow down.
With that, and just to, I guess, to dumb it down, or to make sure people understand, if you're taking the projections of 0.81 going forward, all of a sudden we have a year where we have a year like we just had with equalized value bump of 3 point something. You're projecting or suggesting we use that difference, that potential difference, to fund some more projects that we're not currently funding, going over our set 11.4, 12.4 borrowing cap.
And I would be also make sure you don't blow your wad on one year.
Because the
Say,
next year could
we
have-
got a little capacity, because the other year could go down.
Could go way down,
So
and
it's-
yeah.
we get those bumps, and so we.
But
it's
that's the thought process behind this.
Yeah.
That's where the funding source comes in.
And then it's a
and the
comfort
assumptions
zone.
come.
Comfort zone for council to say, well, let's say we had a 3% growth rate. Wow, great. We'll let you use, 0.81 is the rate, go 1.6, double that, but don't go any farther. Or if it's a 3% growth rate, you can go half of the growth rate, so 1.5. We can play with that and then suggest projects. And so that actually goes to Trina's next slide,
But
so.
suggesting basically that the 12.4, 11.4, whatever the cap, current 11.4 is flexible.
It's flat, but it could also, sadly, it could also go down. So kind of walks into this next slide.
Yes, you've stepped us very well. What happens if favorable economic conditions are not met? I think we definitely would want to reevaluate our target of 50% by 2027. But then we also need to know, and we're this holding place for the FEC projects. When we initially started talking about this with the departments, they referenced it as purgatory. You're going to create a list for purgatory, and I'm like, oh no. And so as we explained it and as we worked through the fundamentals of how do you handle this list, because we want council to be able to act on it if the economic conditions exist, but if we don't get that growth and we don't see that increased value, do they sit in purgatory, or the other more favorable was, do they go to the stairway to heaven? And they all get funded, and that wasn't feasible either.
Is there mezzanine?
There's another term we use, but we won't use because it's a family family show.
And so what we've done is put in some, well, how do we handle these projects that come on this list? So the most important fundament is they will sit on this list for 2 years. In 2 years, they can be acted on by the Common Council at any time and be taken live. If they're not acted on, at the end of the 2 years, they will be rescored and funded in either the first 2 years of the 5-year CIP. What's important about that, because we balance to the first 2 years. So if you can get a project funded in the first 2 years, the probability of it succeeding and going forward is very high.
But in number one, that means that something's got to get bumped, because it's not, the money doesn't get created, but we have to do something with this project.
You're changing out one for another.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's fundamentally what we'd have to do.
Yep.
I guess I ask as we call it, we don't forget the tough lessons that were learned when the economy was down. And now that we're getting fat, dumb, and happy, it's kind of, it's not gonna last, guys. And
There's always a downturn.
we've gotta remember the lessons we learned when things weren't.
And so that's what leads us really nicely into option 2. And kind of why I started with the gotta do, need to do, should do. We establish scoring metrics. The second option would be you rescore the project and it may get put in years 3 to 5 of the CIP. So not be in that secure state. Or option 3, the project is entirely removed from the CIP. And so it's still incorporating those base fundamental concepts of our first approach to capital improvement, and then also our new policy, which enhanced and created those scoring metrics for assignment.
So what you're gonna see in the CIP are 19 and 20 are fully funded. That's based on the 12-4. But these other projects, which right now, I would argue that they're already in purgatory, and we put them on a list. We've done a couple things in previous years. A couple years, we put them at the end of the 5-year CIP and basically said, oh, here they are. And they've been perpetually on that list. And I'm not speaking in favor of one project or another, but the fire training facility is a classic example. And it's like, is it just gonna stay there forever? Well, we don't have the funding for it, so it just ended up there. Alternatively, we tried to move it up and say, well, these are projects that we just wanna let you know are here, and we're not saying they're not in the 5-year CIP, but we can't afford them. This way, we kind of move them up a little bit and saying, depending on circumstances, here's your alternate list of things to look at. Now, council could take a look, and frankly, council could look at the CIP list and say, I don't agree with this project that you have in the CIP and funded. And the council has every right and discretion to pull that and move it out. But you'll also have an alternative list. If things are bad, we're gonna have to come back and council says, we can only do 10 million, Mark. The economy's turned, we got a rough time going, you gotta do that. That's what we'll do. But I think this will give you the ability to move it up or down. And we have to acknowledge that there will be a downturn. We just don't know when. If we could predict that, we could go do the stock market, but we don't have that ability. But we gotta be ready to react quickly and responsibly when this happens. So, it's kind of cheating because I think council's all received a copy of the CIP. The Plan Commission just reviewed it the other day.
Couple of questions, but
So the 2020 projects are in there already. But the first one is an example of projects that are not funded. And you may recall that during our strategic planning workshop, there was a question that was asked, what bad case scenarios could you see happening? And there were some pretty tragic outcomes that people were talking about, but oddly enough, both Alan Davis and I came up with something that was, what bad thing could happen? And from a financial standpoint, it'd be the Pioneer Inn gets somebody that wants to rehabilitate it, and now we have to come up with the Riverwalk, which is going to be about $7 million, and extend 9th Street from Main Street into the Pioneer. Neither of those projects are bad. In fact, I think virtually everybody in town would say, yes, we need to do those, but we don't have the funding for it. So those are that's just one example, and we took a look at that. We took a different view. It's like sometimes the worst news is good news, bad news type of thing. So these are projects, and we're not here to talk about any of the individual projects.
No.
They're just here. These are the ones that didn't make the cut. These are the, if you want to use a good NCAA basketball tournament, these are the teams that didn't make, these are the first four out type of thing. These are projects that all have value, and every department head who is represented in this list can effectively tell you why these are good projects. These are gotta do's, and maybe need to do, and in some cases you could argue they're a should do. In any case, we don't have the money within $12.4 million to fund these. And you can see the total is, city contribution itself, $7.3 million. So these are not tiny projects. So I don't think we were gonna go through the projects, were we,
No.
Trina?
We kind of wanted to just give you an idea of what are the projects that we selected to put into this category, and for you to see the diversity and see some of the approach that we took when separating out these projects. And it is a realm of projects, and this separation exists in 2021 and 2022.
With 2020, I'll just give you an example. Some of these may not be absolutely needed right now, but for example, we have the 9th Avenue extension, which I mentioned. Something happens with Pioneer, suddenly that becomes a gotta do. The Southwest Industrial Park, if the transload facility takes off and they have a bunch of customers and people wanting to buy land there, that becomes a gotta do. And council would expect us to come back with a solution. So these are classic examples, and those are economic development ones. There's other ones as well, but it just gives you a good idea. 2021, there's fewer projects, so the type is bigger. But Parks building, we've talked about Parks Department renovation for years. $5 million, we just can't fit that. That would take almost half of our entire annual allocation. I think everybody agrees that that building is old and tired and needs to get replaced. But is it a gotta do? It's probably more of a need to do. Then last year, we just have the museum. And the museum, that's more on the, probably the should-do list because it's a quality of life issue. For the viability of the museum, that's something worth looking at.
So that's our overall presentation. We've put a new philosophical idea out there. Are there any questions that we can answer in regards to that?
No, not specifically in regards to that. I don't mind that idea. At least gives us more flexibility. I'm concerned with the assumption of another $1 million on top for next year that you're going to ask us to consider this fall. When you come back with that, I know myself, I'm going to want to know, what am I getting for that $1 million? What is it? Just, and we've talked about this before, is it just cost increases on projects, additional project, or is there a project identified that if we can't, or if we don't think that $1 million is attainable, what's coming out for $1 million on that side of it. So when we get to that point
Yeah.
later down the road, I'd like that info.
Yeah.
I know that's not a tonight meeting, so, or a tonight discussion, but just as a heads
Well,
up.
just a quick answer though, because I think it bears
Probably a combination
answering.
of everything a little bit.
The $1 million is, we've been putting about $3.8 million, basically 1/3 of our annual allotment of the 11.4. A full 1/3 has been for streets. So the cause of it is streets, plain and simple. However, the other half of your question, what would we do if you said, it's gotta be 11.4 still, Mark and Trina? It's gotta be 11.4. The answer to the question, to that half of the question, wouldn't necessarily be cutting back the street projects, because the street projects, it's hard to carve out
Yeah.
$1 million unless you say, we're gonna do less of the street. Do we do less of Oregon Street or something like that? Then that becomes not a 5-year project, but a 6-year project. So that's a tougher question. But we know that the cause of it is increased costs for materials for building, because frankly, the competition for contractors' work, they can inch their prices up. We got really good prices for the Oshkosh site because we gave them a lot of flexibility on time.
The timeframe was very flexible. It allowed them to work over the winter, if weather conditions permitted, that they could work over the winter. So it was winter work, and then it was, guaranteed spring work for what they didn't get done. At this point in time, contractors don't have backlog for spring 2019 built up yet. We have been hearing some rumblings that some communities are starting to bid 2019 work already, just to try to, get ahead of the game, so to speak. So, that was the two biggest reasons why we saw a number of bidders, more than we've seen on projects in a while, and very competitive pricing was because we were able to be very flexible with that project.
Yeah, I wanted to answer your question now because I think they're really two separate questions, and
And when we set the 11.4, we were pretty hard-headed about, we didn't want that number to ever change. It was,
But 11.4 then is an 11.4 now.
right, that was a number from 2014, so that's at least 4 years old.
it's gonna be 11.4 forever, was our thing. My three, they're not here, that would remember.
And that buying power, reduces over time.
And I remember a couple of years ago, there was a presentation at UWO with the American Society for Civil Engineers, and there was, actually, it was a former council member of ours, Kevin,
McGee.
McGee, and he complimented us on the timing when we really put the pedal to the metal in terms of getting street projects done. We were going forward very fast and heavy when the prices were low. So we bought low, which was, the old adage, buy low, sell high. We bought at the right time. We still need to do, and I guess the other approach we've been using the last few years has been dollar cost averaging. 11.4 every year, but eventually we gotta ratchet that up. And that's what we feel is necessary. But no other additional projects have been added except that the prices that we're estimating for our CIPs are higher.
Yeah, everything that we're hearing from the contracting world, we're starting to see prices, especially on our street reconstruction projects where, we don't have the luxury of being as flexible with our timings. With the Oshkosh Oshkosh Corp infrastructure project, it is a little bit more of a greenfield project. We've got a little longer time frame. We could be very flexible. With our street reconstruction projects, we're trying to minimize the impacts as much as possible while not being overly burdensome on the contractor, because the more you shorten windows, the more the contractor says, well, okay, you're giving me 5 weeks to do 7 weeks worth of work. That means I got to put in, 30 hours of overtime every week to meet your schedule. So that, drives the cost up. So, we got to be a little bit realistic, but at the same time, we got to try to reduce the impacts as much as we can. Because I think, we can all agree, a street reconstruction project is very disturbing to the people that are on that street.
I know.
Yeah, as you well know, Mayor, yes.
And you're gonna find out
Hard to get
soon.
around that part of town right now.
Oh, heavens.
Well, I think you answer Matt's question too. What's the buying power of 11.4 in 2014 to 2019? I mean,
Yeah.
how much more of that million do we need to get the same stuff?
Fuel prices have been an issue, and that impacts, we don't do a lot of asphalt, but we do some asphalt, and oil prices have inched up since 2014. So those are just, everybody deals with that. We are not alone, and we still have to show our fiscal constraint. The idea that we want to plant the seed with you, in the short term, we're recommending 12.4. That's a short-term, so that's a short-term recommendation for 2019. The bigger picture is, where do we want to be? And I think given what the goal the council set 4 years ago that we've achieved 2 years early was a worthwhile goal. What's our next goal? What do we want to reach for? We just put 2027 because that was what was on our sheet, and we said, is it doable? And given the right circumstances, it is. Council could say, we'd rather set that goal earlier or later. Let's go to 2030, or we want it done sooner in 2025. If you say that, then we got to borrow less, flat out. If you say, well, I do like some of these projects on your economic conditions list, well, then what do you want to do? And a lot of it's going to depend on the circumstances. And I'd rather continue to have a modest 12.4, keep going that route, and then depending on the economic conditions. Because, like I said, if something happens with Ninth, are we just going to say, well, we got to pass on that? We're going to either have to reprioritize or borrow more or do one of those things. But I think this approach with Moody's will get them to understand we are responsible and we're making progress, and we're worth looking at, even though we're up in our borrowing a little bit in the short term.
One additional question, and I don't need an answer tonight, but and we've had this discussion in long-range finance, the impact of adding a vehicle registration fee and removing the special assessments from this going forward. Obviously, 2019 general obligation borrowing, you've got 1.2 million in special assessment borrowing, that if we had a vehicle registration fee in place, we would not need to borrow 1.2 million next year.
We could either not borrow, or we could apply more to more streets.
Correct.
But
There's options, but
you decide what you want your
But
dividend to
if
be
we-
on that.
if we had one that completely wiped out special assessments, 1.2 million less in borrowing next year and perpetually from thereafter, that helps get us to our goal faster, as well as potentially move other projects around, so.
That'd be a good selling point.
Yep.
So that's really what we have. Now, there's only three of you here, so you don't have to fill up the time, but
This is excellent.
I think the only thing I would give you is I direct you back to your agenda, and for the public so they know where we're headed next. Our next workshop does happen on October 29th and 30th. Those are all-day workshops, and what the Common Council and staff will be doing is going over each department's proposed operation budget as well as their capital improvement program proposals. And so this steps us very nicely into preparing for that. Everybody will present their capital improvement program projects with the exception of Public Works. Public Works, due to the lengthy number of their projects, they do flow into November 6th into our last, November 7th, our last workshop. And so our next large meeting will be televised and is able to be watched. It is an all-day meeting with all the departments here at the City Hall.
the one thing that I would ask, even though we don't have a quorum of council, how would you like us, we had council direction on GeoDebt management. How would you like us to bring that forward? Even though it's only three of you, it's more of a how we bring it forward to you to all seven of you. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you want to wait and have that discussion at at the workshop. I mean, the CIP is in, it's not changing until you change it now. We're done changing it, now it's in your realm. Have you received a copy? I just want to have the council members received a copy, or was it just the plan commission?
Plan
Of
Commission.
what?
The CIP, I
CIP.
believe the council
The
should have
CIP
all received
document.
copies
Yeah.
of that.
Okay, so you have it.
I
Yeah,
think
two-
you should
weeks
have
ago
at
packet.
least gotten it at the same time as Plan Commission, if not just before.
Yeah, I
So
remember seeing
you
it.
have the CIP. The CIP is not going to change until you start changing it. It has 12.4. The 50% goal is not in there. That was
Yeah.
talking about that tonight. So if you can maybe give us some direction on how you want to bring that forward, we can incorporate it into workshop number 6 when we talk about CIP. If you start tweaking things, we're going to need to. I mean, if we need to cut $1 million, we need to do it.
Personally, I think I'd rather have it up front as, in the process, on the next one. I know that those are long days and lots of departments going through, but it may be better to have it early in the discussion rather than later, because you're right, if there's some adjustments that need to be made, they shouldn't be made on the fly. Give them some actual due diligence and some good thought.
I would agree, and this will be televised.
Yes.
Whatever format, it should be understandable to the public. I mean, it's complicated to begin with, so if we can make it very clear.
What I'll do is, I'm not gonna be at next week's meeting, but on October 9th, what I'll do is on the agenda, just remind everybody that we really need to get some direction on that sooner rather than later.
Okay.
And then we'll figure out a way to incorporate it into the workshop, because it's not just about public works, because like I said, I think the solution does not necessarily lie in public works.
No,
So I'll just at least introduce it and plant the seed with everybody, and hopefully the other council members will take a look at this presentation, maybe look at the video, and if they have some questions, they can ask us so we can get a feel for where council is on this. But I think the flexibility part is really what we're trying to pitch to you, and I think it's worth talking about. And the 50% goal is a pure policy issue. So again, that's your guys' call.
And one thing I'll put out too, and I hope you guys agree, that whatever we do, we don't want to slow down the momentum. We are just at a pace I've not seen this community for decades with all that's happening. The citizens like it, they understand it, they're appreciative of it, they're supportive of it, and I think we've got to just keep moving.
Yeah, we don't want to stop projects now, because the projects are only gonna cost more later.
Yeah.
And they're gonna have to be done later no matter what.
So if you have any other feedback, please don't be afraid to give us a holler. Trina, myself, if you're starting to think about projects, the lion's share of the CIP is James, and he and his staff are more than happy to talk about those.
one last question, because memory doesn't serve me at the moment, and I don't have my TIF information in front of me. When you were taking into account the assumption, or specifically this year, we had TIF, we're having a TIF 7 closure. That's obviously a substantial bump in valuation over the next, your projections for 9 years. When you show us this again, can you identify any TIF closures in there and anticipated valuation additions into that? So you can actually have, even if you're assuming 0.8 or 0.4 growth, adding on TIF X.
We get are we looking for any bonus?
Well, I mean, if where's our goal? And if we have a 50% goal, how soon do we actually get there with those closures as well?
We can provide that.
Thank you. I don't remember how many I don't know how many we would have closing in the next 8 to 9 years.
We have
A
a
few.
limited
There's a
number.
few.
Not as
What they
big, but a
actually
few.
add,
ones.
Yeah, but no, that's a legit question, because the biggest bumps we've had have been TIF closures.
Yeah.
Very good.
If there are no further questions or discussion, we think we call it a day, everyone. We'll be back on air with the next budget workshop on October 29. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.